Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you were completely alone? Ever felt that shiver that runs down your spine, as if something or someone was behind you, but when you turned around, everything was calm and still? Most people ignore this. They call it paranoia, a tired mind, or even silly superstition. But what if I told you that sometimes what we feel isn't just an impression? What if, for a second, the thing we swore was dead, reacted? My name is Mike, and for 15 years I was a gravedigger in a rural Ohio cemetery. I saw things I can't explain, heard sounds that came from nowhere, and buried people who seemed more alive than many who still breathe. But there was one day, one moment, that redefined everything I believed about life and death. And no matter how much time passes, that scene keeps coming back every time I close my eyes. It was supposed to be just another ordinary burial. A 63-year-old man deceased at home with his family. Present and the funeral mass organized as per protocol. Everything was normal until the moment we lowered the coffin. And it was at that moment, and I regret looking, that the dead man's eyes blinked. It wasn't a reflex, it wasn't imagination. It was a real slow blink, like someone recognizing you. No one said anything, no one screamed. But the air changed. That cemetery, already silent by nature, plunged into something I can only describe as a vacuum, a suffocating silence, as if time had stopped to observe what would happen next. The widow's breath hitched, her daughter's hand trembled, and I stood there, motionless, holding one of the ropes supporting the coffin, trying to understand if my mind had broken, or if hell had begun right there, in that hole. You think you know what fear is. Wait until you see a dead person looking directly at you. But the scariest part was yet to come. You're about to enter a territory where neither logic nor faith can explain what happens. Here, the accounts aren't just stories. They're living memories of those who saw, heard, and felt the impossible. If you've ever experienced something no one believed, if your skin has ever crawled for no reason and your breath caught in the face of something invisible, then this channel is for you. You're one of those few who see beyond what meets the eye. And that's why I invite you now. Subscribe to the channel to be part of this community that doesn't fear the unknown. Like this video, so more. People can hear these hidden truths and get ready, because this story is only beginning. On that particular day, everything seemed to conspire to create a heavy atmosphere. The sky was shrouded in low, motionless clouds, as if they had stopped there merely to witness what was to come. The wind blew slowly, dragging dry leaves over the ancient tombs of cracked granite, and the sound of the breeze seemed more like a whisper than a natural movement. It was one of those days when any noise, no matter how small, echoed in the silence of the landscape like a threat. The cemetery where I worked was on the outskirts of Lancaster, Ohio. A simple plot of land, surrounded by an iron fence that creaked in the wind. It seemed to have withstood the test of time more out of pride than structure. It was a place forgotten by many, frequented only by old families from the area, and a few religious people who still believed in the importance of the rites. But that Saturday, something unusual hung in the air, and I sensed it from the moment I arrived. The man to be buried was named Thomas Griggs. A retired truck driver, 63 years old, he lived alone after losing his wife. According to records, he died in his sleep from cardiac arrest. Nothing suspicious. No forensic intervention. Everything was expected for a quick and discreet burial. The funeral home had prepared the body the night before, and the sealed casket was delivered to the chapel early that morning. Few people were present. An eldest daughter, visibly shaken, a former sister-in-law, 2 colleagues from the transportation company, and a local pastor with a voice that seemed over-rehearsed for such an intimate moment. The words of the sermon echoed hollowly, unconnected to the people actually present. No crying, no loud wailing, just an awkward silence, as if everyone wanted it to be over. I'd attended dozens of funerals with less structure and more emotion. But this one, it felt forced, as if no one wanted to be there, not even the deceased. And when I saw the casket being prepared for burial, with everyone's eyes averted at once, something inside me understood. There was more to this ceremony than anyone there was willing to admit. But you know that kind of silence, that seems to hide a muffled scream. That's exactly what I felt at that moment. And believe me, when the coffin began to descend, what happened next transformed that ordinary funeral into a nightmare that no one dares to talk about. To this day, my name is Mike, and if there's one thing I've learned over 15 years working as a gravedigger, it's that death isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of something no one wants to discover. When I started this job, I was too young to understand the weight the earth carries. I thought it was just manual labor, burying coffins and keeping the lawn tidy. But little by little, you realize that what surrounds you isn't just wood, marble, and ashes. It's pain, silence, and sometimes that which cannot be explained. I'd worked in many cemeteries in the area, but I settled on this small plot of land on the outskirts of Lancaster for one simple reason. No one asked too many questions. The routine was predictable, the co-workers discreet, and the dead stayed where they belonged. At least, that's what I thought. I've never been the kind of man easily impressed. I've witnessed bodies that arrived in deplorable condition, wakes where children argued next to the casket, and court-ordered burials in the middle of the night. But none of these experiences prepared me for what I experienced that day. I was the primary burial attendant for Thomas Griggs. I had the spreadsheet with the ceremony times, casket placement, grave information, and support staff supervision. Everything was under control, as always. But from the first glance at the body, something bothered me. His face was too rigid, not just from the embalming process. It was as if there was a hidden tension there, as if the muscles were trying to react, even at rest. I spoke briefly with the pastor before the ceremony and asked about the family. He said Thomas was a reserved man, not very social, and hadn't been to church in over 20 years. It seems he didn't care about leaving memories, the pastor commented with an uncomfortable half smile. That stuck with me, because in that moment, I sensed there was something about him that didn't want to be forgotten. Something that perhaps was still attached to this world. Gravediggers often develop a sort of sixth sense, an instinct to alert when something is out of place. And in this case, all the signs were there. The strange atmosphere, the daughter's vacant gaze, the uncomfortable silence. But what really chilled me was the widow's behavior. Sitting in the back, arms crossed, she didn't shed a single tear. It seemed she already knew this burial wouldn't mark the end of anything. And indeed, it didn't. Because when the coffin began to descend and Thomas's face moved, I knew my job there wasn't just to bury a body. It was to try not to go crazy over what I saw next. You might think it's all over when the earth covers the coffin. But that day, something inside me screamed that it was just beginning, and what happened in the next few minutes was so real that to this day I avoid counting on the lights being out. Some wakes are silent out of respect, others out of profound sadness. But this one was silent because of something no one dared to name. From the moment Thomas's body arrived at the chapel, the atmosphere felt contaminated. There were no sincere tears, no spontaneous prayers. People stood there as if forcibly summoned, like extras in a play. They already knew how it would end, but didn't want to be on stage. The scent of the flowers, instead of bringing comfort, was cloying. Too strong, almost as if they were trying to disguise something denser in the air. The chapel was simple, with glass windows slightly fogged by the cold and wooden benches that creaked when anyone moved. The coffin rested in the center, and even closed, it seemed to have a presence. And it wasn't just my impression. I saw one of the assistants, a young man who had worked with me for a short time, avert his eyes every time he passed by. Another employee avoided touching the coffin for personal reasons, but no one dared to express their feelings. It was as if everyone shared the same fear, but without verbalizing it. Thomas's daughter, seated in the front row, kept her gaze fixed on the floor, as if avoiding her dead father's gaze were a way of protecting herself. The widow, in a far corner, watched the scene with an expression that didn't quite fit the moment. It was neutral, cold, almost satisfied, as if something had gone exactly as she'd hoped. But the strangest thing was when the pastor began the ceremony. His voice, always firm and rehearsed, faltered with the first few words. He coughed. He paused for a second, composed himself and resumed, but the glance he cast at the casket, quick, nervous, didn't escape me. It was then that I realized everyone was feeling it. The discomfort wasn't mine, not the result of my tired mind or some silly superstition. It was something real, palpable, almost thick in the air, an invisible weight that hung over every word spoken, every held breath. Even the wind that blew against the windows seemed more timid, as if it, too, didn't want to disturb whatever was inside that coffin. I've been to violent funerals filled with pain, screams, and breakdowns, but nothing compared to this fearful silence. And that's precisely why, when it came time to carry the body out of the chapel, my hands trembled, because a part of me knew that whatever we were about to bury hadn't yet accepted its departure. And when we placed the coffin on the ropes and began the descent process, the impossible happened before my eyes. And the worst part, only I had the courage to face it. Have you ever felt like an entire room was trying to warn you without saying a word? That's exactly what I experienced at that wake. But what no one knew is that the true horror hadn't even begun yet, and I would be the only one to face it head on. The time for the burial arrived. The final part, the one that usually brings some kind of relief to the family. A sense of closure, however painful. But there, no one seemed to want to approach the grave. The daughter hesitated before standing, as if her feet were rooted to the spot. The widow, with the same immobile expression, remained seated, staring into space. The co-workers didn't exchange a word, and I, with my face slightly tilted, simply played my part, as always. The coffin was lowered onto the ropes with precision. I was on the left side, one hand gripping the safety strap. The pastor stood on the other side, murmuring a psalm. One of the assistants adjusted the width of the grave opening. It was all mechanical, practical, emotionless. And then, as the coffin began to slowly descend, obeying the synchronized movement of the ropes, I looked. I looked reflexively, instinctively, perhaps even out of defiance. But I did. And it was at that moment that everything inside me froze. The coffin lid, which was ajar due to a mistake by the funeral home, allowed a tiny sliver of vision. I couldn't see his entire face, only part of it, but it was enough. Because there, in the dim light of polished wood and dimmed light, Thomas's left eye moved. I saw clearly. It wasn't a spasm. It wasn't a post-mortem contraction, like those we sometimes witness in the first minutes after death. No, the eye closed, slowly. The eyelid lowered in a slow, almost careful movement, and then just as slowly it rose. A blink, conscious, directed. At that moment my stomach lurched, my legs wobbled, and I almost let go of the rope. But I remained there, motionless, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The pastor stopped reading. He looked at me. The surrounding helpers also looked away toward the grave, as if something had called them, even without sound. No one spoke, but I knew from their faces I wasn't the only one who saw it. Something in the atmosphere changed in that instant. The temperature dropped, even under the timid morning sun. The air seemed denser. The birds, which usually sing around the field, fell silent. The silence, which had previously been uncomfortable, was now almost cruel. A forced pause in time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask if anyone had seen what I had, but my mouth wouldn't respond. My mind tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was a reflection of light, a play of shadows, a hallucination brought on by fatigue, but deep down, I knew. That man blinked. He saw me. He knew I was there. Once the burial was over, everyone dispersed too quickly. No hugs, no words exchanged. It was as if it had awakened an ancient fear in everyone present, the kind of fear no one can explain, only feel. But what bothered me most, this wasn't the blinking, it was the feeling that it was just the first gesture, the beginning of something that wasn't over yet, because the next night, something even more disturbing happened. You can try to forget what you saw, but when a dead person stares back at you, something inside you changes. And that night, while everyone was trying to move on, he decided to come back. And what came next was even worse. When the coffin finally touched the bottom of the grave, I felt as if the world had held its breath. There was no clapping, no loud prayers, just a sepulchral silence. And not just in the literal sense. It was a heavy, almost complicit silence. Every person present seemed to be avoiding something, as if the simple act of speaking could materialize what everyone else was trying to ignore. And I, my sweaty hands still trembling from the tension caused by blinking, began to notice the details around me with frightening clarity. The deceased's daughter, who had previously kept her eyes fixed on the ground, now kept them closed. Her hands clutched the fabric of her dress so tightly that her knuckles were white. Her former sister-in-law stared at the grave with a blank expression, as if she had disconnected from reality. And the neighbor, a gentleman in a cap who had greeted everyone politely upon arrival, took a step back as subtle as it was involuntary. But I saw it. I saw the fear in his eyes. The pastor, who would normally end the ceremony with a blessing and words of comfort, merely murmured a hurried "Amen." There was no final glance, no invitation to pray together. He simply closed the Bible, took a deep breath, and turned, striding out without even waiting for the family. It was the first time I'd seen a religious leader leave before everyone else at a funeral. My colleagues, who were supposed to begin covering the coffin with earth, hesitated. One looked at the other as if seeking confirmation that it was safe to continue. One of the younger ones, wide-eyed, asked in a low voice if he had seen what he thought he had. I didn't answer, because right then and there, I realized no one was willing to admit it. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of sanity, or maybe out of pure self-preservation. What happened at that wake was real. It was seen. It was felt. But the weight of collective fear created an invisible barrier, a silent pact. No one said a word about it. Blinking, no one dared. As if by ignoring it, they were protecting themselves from something that could return. But the truth is, silence doesn't protect. It only postpones. And when I returned home that night, I realized that what I carried wasn't just the weariness of yet another burial. It was the gaze of someone who, even buried, hadn't yet said goodbye. And this certainty became even stronger when, the following morning, something woke me up. Something that seemed to have returned to finish what it started. That night I could barely lie down. My mind seemed trapped in an endless loop of images and sensations, the blinking, the weight of the gaze, the deafening silence of the living. Everything blended together like a heavy fog around my thoughts. I sat on the edge of the bed for long minutes, watching the bedroom wall, as if waiting for it to open up in some kind of response. And the more time passed, the more what I had seen began to become a muffled scream inside me. It was as if my mind was trying, at all costs, to transform that moment into an illusion. I found myself rationalizing, thinking of physiological explanations, perhaps a delayed post-mortem reflex, perhaps some muscular reaction caused by embalming. But even with all my years of experience dealing with bodies, burials, and extinct vital signs, I knew it wasn't natural. And worst of all, it wasn't just an involuntary movement. It had intention, it had direction, it had presence. I grabbed a glass of water, sat in the living room and remained silent. No television on, no sound, just darkness and the occasional creaking of my house's ancient structure. And then, as if someone whispered in my ear, I remembered the words Thomas's widow had whispered at the end of the ceremony. "Not to me, not to anyone," she said softly, adjusting her purse strap before leaving. "He never accepted death." Those words came back with frightening force. He never accepted death. They echoed inside my chest like a muffled drum, vibrating in rhythm with my breathing. How many people have you known who refused to leave this world? How many stories have you heard of people who seemed to be merely sleeping? It made me question not only what had happened in that grave, but what was about to happen to me. And that morning, lying with my eyes open in the darkness, I heard a sound coming from the backyard, a soft but continuous noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. My house is near the cemetery, and although I've always lived comfortably with this quiet neighborhood, that night I felt something different, something approaching but needing no doors to enter. I got up slowly, walked to the window, and looked outside. There was no one there, just the wind. But something inside me told me it wasn't the wind that had woken me. It was him. And that's why, the next day, I returned to the cemetery alone. What I found there, I'll never forget. The next morning, I arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual. The sun was still hidden behind clouds, and the mist covering the field seemed like a veil over the graves, as if the ground itself were trying to hide something. I walked slowly, feeling the early morning chill still clinging to my bones. The damp earth sank slightly beneath my feet, but what bothered me most was the absolute silence. Not even the birds dared to sing that day. I went straight to Thomas's grave. Something was pulling me there like a magnet, a nagging feeling that hadn't left me alone since I woke up. When I arrived, I stopped a few steps from the tomb and immediately sensed something was out of place. The contours of the earth were altered. The surface, which should have been smooth and level after the burial, showed small ripples, as if something had moved inside. It wasn't enough to resemble a grave violation, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I moved closer, observing every detail carefully. That's when I noticed something that left me speechless. Footprints. They weren't human footprints, at least not complete ones. Light marks, as if someone had walked barefoot around the grave, but without a clear heel, as if the steps had been dragged. And the strangest thing, the marks didn't come from the outside in. They appeared right there, around the tomb, and disappeared before reaching any other direction. The marks looked fresh, newly formed, as if something or someone had moved around there during the night. The problem is that the cemetery is locked at night. Only I and 2 other employees have a key, and I hadn't been back since the burial. The other employee was away for health reasons, and the caretaker from the night before swore nothing unusual had happened. But the earth told a different story. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, maybe marks left by the helpers themselves the day before. But I knew what the ground had looked like when we finished the burial, and none of it was there that night. The only rational explanation would be an animal, a cub perhaps, but there were no scratches, no digging, and there was a smell. It wasn't the odor of decay. It was something drier, like burnt earth mixed with rust and moss, an old smell, a smell that didn't belong in this cemetery. As I bent down to touch the ground, I felt a slight tremor beneath my palm. It wasn't an earthquake. It was like a faint but constant vibration rising from the earth straight into my bones. I immediately pulled my hand away. My heart raced. I stood up, took a deep breath and looked around, expecting to see someone, but of course there was nothing. The field was empty, but the grave, no. The grave pulsed, as if trying to warn me that it hadn't finished its work. The feeling didn't leave me for the rest of the day. Everything I did, everything I tried to focus on, returned to the image of those marks on the ground and the subtle vibration that seemed to rise from underground. Even in the cafeteria, during lunch with my colleagues, my mind returned to that moment. The spoon stopped mid-spoon. My stomach churned. One of the staff noticed my distant gaze and asked if I was okay. I said yes, but it was a lie. I knew something had changed since that burial, and it wasn't just in the earth, it was in me too. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake for hours, lying on my side, listening to the sounds of dawn filter through the bedroom window. I heard cracking in the walls, creaking on the floor, and soft knocks coming from nowhere. Around 2:30 in the morning, I got up. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It wasn't snowing or raining, but there was a humidity in the air that made everything heavier, as if something invisible filled every space in the house. I grabbed a flashlight, put on my boots, and headed back to the cemetery. I don't usually do this, but there was something about that night that wouldn't let me stop. I walked steadily across the dirt field, trying to appear braver than I felt. The fog was thicker than the previous morning, and when I opened the back gate and entered, the sensation returned. That same vibration underfoot, but stronger now, almost as if I were being pulled. I reached Thomas's grave. The flashlight's beam wavered in my hand, and then I saw it. The footprints had changed. They were deeper now, as if the feet had pressed harder. And there was more. Something that hadn't been there before. A small scrap of cloth stuck in the grass near the headstone. I bent down and picked it up. It was a fragment of blue flannel, the same color as the shirt Thomas wore on the day of the burial. It was damp, but not soaked, and the cloth warm. I took a step back, still clutching the cloth. My eyes darted across the open field. The flashlight caught movement among the headstones. Something quick, small. A figure? An animal? I couldn't identify it. But the chill I felt wasn't from the wind. It was from within. It was as if something were watching me from some dark corner, as if, in that moment, I was no longer the only one alive. I returned home with that doubt in my hands. The fragment of shirt remained in my closet drawer for days. I didn't have the heart to throw it away. And from that moment on, the reports from the town began. Someone swears they saw Thomas walking. But it wasn't just once, nor in just one place. The town was beginning to show signs that death hadn't fulfilled its purpose, and that grave was just beginning to open from within. In the days following Thomas Griggs's burial, the city seemed to breathe differently. It wasn't visible, it wasn't something anyone openly commented on, but I could feel it. People were more reserved, less smiling, as if carrying a silent weight, and the whispers began. Low, disconnected, disguised as routine conversations in the grocery store aisles, on park benches, or in gas station lines. Whispers about someone who shouldn't be out there. The first story came from a long-time resident of Thomas's neighborhood. An elderly gentleman, known for exaggerating his memories, claimed to have seen someone who looked exactly like Thomas on the sidewalk outside the liquor store, standing there, staring unblinkingly at the window. He said he waved but received no response, and that the man simply turned and walked toward the bushes behind the road, a place where there's no exit. When neighbors checked, no one was there, and the tracks in the ground led nowhere. The next day, a newspaper delivery boy dropped a curious comment to a customer. He said that, as he turned the corner onto Cedar Street around 5 in the morning, he saw a man standing in front of the old Griggs house. The description was identical: a blue flannel shirt, slumped shoulders, hands stuffed in his pockets. He didn't move. He just stared at the delivery man for an unspecified amount of time. He said his eyes seemed dull, as if they were there, but soulless. When he blinked, the man was gone. Later, a woman who worked downtown told a friend, who told her son, who happened to be a cousin of one of my co-workers, that when she went out to throw out the trash at the back of the restaurant, she saw a figure standing next to the dumpster. He was a thin man with grey hair and a blue flannel shirt, exactly like the one Thomas wore on the day of the funeral. She said he mumbled something incomprehensible, but seemed to be asking for help. And then he disappeared into the fog. These reports, which initially seemed like exaggerations from a small town with too much time on its hands, began to accumulate unsettlingly. Within days, 4 people swore they'd seen the same figure near the old shipping depot where Thomas had worked for years. They all said he didn't seem threatening or aggressive, but there was something about his presence, something broken, dislocated, as if he were lost between 2 worlds. A teenager swore he saw the figure walking in the middle of the dirt road near the abandoned school. He didn't tell his parents, but let it slip during a conversation with a friend who recorded the audio and showed it to me. The boy said, with a choked voice, that he thought it was an ordinary person until he realized the man's feet weren't touching the ground. He said he saw it clearly. He floated, almost imperceptibly, as if his own weight had been forgotten along with the coffin. Another account claimed a dog began howling every night at 3 in the morning, staring fixedly at the cemetery wall as if waiting for someone to jump over. The dog's owner, a widower who lived alone, said he once heard footsteps in the backyard, and when he went outside to check, there was nothing except deep footprints in the wet earth, as if someone in heavy boots had circled the house, footprints that stopped right at the living room door. But there was no turning back. No one dared say out loud that it was Thomas. But everyone knew, and this silent knowledge gnawed at the town's tranquility like termites gnawing at the structure of an old house. It wasn't fear of what they might see, it was fear of what it represented. Fear that death was no longer the limit. Fear that eternal rest was just an illusion. I started noticing strange looks in my direction too. At the market, 2 ladies whispered to me as I passed the canned goods aisle. A little boy, the son of a colleague from the city hall, pointed at me in the square and said, "He's the one who saw the dead man blink." His mother was speechless, and so was I, because until then no one knew what I had witnessed. And yet, somehow, they knew. I was taken aside by a colleague from the funeral home. He seemed nervous, sweating despite the cold. He said that if I'd seen something strange at Thomas's funeral, it was best not to say anything, that some things should be left unsaid, and that casket shouldn't have been opened, not even by mistake. He looked me in the eye and added, "You think he saw you, don't you?" I remained silent. There was nothing to say because, yes, I knew he saw me. And for some reason I still couldn't explain, that seemed to establish a connection between us. As if the moment our eyes met, something had been activated, a thin line between the world of the living and the dead. And now I walked on it. It was then that I knew that all of this wasn't a collective imagination. It was real. It was happening. And what gave me chills weren't the reports from the streets nor the rumors around town. It was what I discovered days later when I reviewed the chapel's security camera tape. But before the tape, there was one last appearance. A couple driving along the rural road leading to the cemetery confidently claimed they saw a man standing outside the gate. He wasn't trying to enter. He was just watching. The woman described him accurately: a blue flannel shirt, dark pants, and a face that looked hurt. She said she felt the urge to stop, to ask if he needed help. But something stopped her. A chill ran down her spine, a feeling that if she stopped, something very wrong would happen. She only commented on the incident days later when she overheard a conversation about Thomas. Upon seeing a photo of him, her eyes widened and she said, "It was him. It was that man. I swear on everything." And in that moment I had confirmation, because the dead can rest. But some, when buried with secrets too heavy, simply refuse to accept. The end. And when that happens, the city's silence turns into a muffled scream, a scream that only the attentive can hear. And I was listening, louder and louder. The chapel at the cemetery where I work has a single security camera. An old piece of equipment installed years ago at the city's request after a case of vandalism. Almost no one pays attention to it. Most don't even know it exists. But I did. And after everything that had been happening, I decided to access it. Not because I wanted answers, I already imagined the truth, but because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my sanity. I entered the maintenance room with the key I'd kept for years. It was a narrow space, smelling of dust and damp insulation. In the corner, the old monitor still worked, and next to it, the recording system with the week's tapes. I found the one from the day of Thomas's funeral. Trembling, I inserted the tape into the player, pressed play, and let it spin. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The ceremony proceeded as I remembered. People sat in silence. The pastor delivered his formal speech. The widow watched with her arms crossed. But then, as the casket was placed in the center of the chapel, the camera, even in its low, shaky resolution, captured a detail that made me stop breathing for a few seconds. During a specific moment, when one of the attendants stumbles slightly and the camera shakes for a second, the coffin rocks. And in that brief instant, the lid moves a little more than it should. The lens captures Thomas's face at a direct angle, and there, with disturbing clarity, the little finger on his left hand moves. A single movement, a slight flexing of the phalanx. But it wasn't a reflex. The image no longer shook. The environment was static, and he moved his finger. I stood motionless in front of the monitor. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to cry, another wanted to laugh nervously, but mostly I just felt fear. Real fear. The kind that leaves your neck hot and your hands cold. I rewound. I watched it again, and the movement repeated itself, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present. I watched it 3 times. I paused, fast-forwarded, and rewinded. Each time the same detail appeared, Thomas's hand moving subtly, as if signaling something or someone. The silence in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if the room itself were absorbing my reaction. The overhead light flickered, and the sound of the tape rotation system was louder than it should have been. It was as if the room were trying to swallow me. I decided to extract the tape. I wanted to keep it as evidence. But before I could eject the device, the door to the room opened. It was the afternoon janitor, a gentleman who rarely spoke to me. He just looked at the screen, then back at me and said calmly, "You shouldn't be seeing this." His tone wasn't threatening. It was more like a warning, almost as if he knew exactly what I'd seen. I stood there, speechless, just watching as he walked away without another word. That sentence echoed in my mind for hours. How did he know? Why did he say it with such certainty? I returned the next day to retrieve the tape. I arrived early before the janitor or any other staff member showed up, but upon entering the room, I found the system had rebooted. Thomas's burial date was no longer in the file, not on the disk, not on the backup tapes. Everything had been erased, not due to a technical error. It was as if the image had never existed, as if someone or something had made a point of wiping every trace. I spent the night awake. The sound of the monitor, the image of the moving finger, the janitor's gaze, everything repeated in my head like a constant echo. But what bothered me most wasn't the tape itself. It was the fact that even without it, something still seemed to haunt me. And this became clear that very morning, when I closed my eyes and dreamed of the chapel. In the dream, I was alone inside the sacred space. Thomas's coffin was open, but there was no one around. The windows were fogged, and a thin mist pervaded the room. I slowly approached the body. Everything was silent, but I felt as if I were being watched. When I finally looked inside the coffin, the body was gone, just a crumpled sheet. And at the bottom, a tape. The same tape from the security system. I took it in my hands, and when I looked back, Thomas's figure was standing at the altar, his eyes wide open, staring straight into mine. Without moving his lips, he said something. I didn't hear a sound, but I understood perfectly what he was saying. It's not the end, it's the beginning. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight, the same phrase echoing inside me. I tried to forget. I convinced myself it was all a result of my mental exhaustion. But the dreams continued, each night, more vivid. The tape returned, the look too, and the words changed, as if preparing me for something yet to come. One of the dreams, the tape unrolled on its own, and instead of the ceremony, it showed places in the cemetery that even I didn't know. Ancient, forgotten graves, with symbols I'd never seen before, voices in the background, distant whispers, and the sound of earth being turned. I knew deep down that I was no longer dealing with just a memory or an isolated scare. This had ceased to be a strange event and had become a presence, something that connected to me through memories, images, and now, through dreams. It wasn't a hallucination, it was a calling, and no matter how much I tried to turn away, ignore it, or rationalize it, a part of me knew. Thomas wasn't at peace, and I had unwittingly become the only link between him and the world of the living. Because the tape may have been erased, but what it recorded remains engraved inside me. And what comes after this, no one will be able to erase it. After that tape, I could never go back to being myself. I stayed at the cemetery for a few more weeks, trying to feign normalcy. I dug graves, organized rituals, and cleared the ground as if the earth beneath my feet weren't pulsing with a truth no one wanted to face. But inside, something had changed. The certainty that Thomas wasn't simply dead, or worse, that perhaps he had never accepted death, gnawed at me day after day. My nights became torture. When I managed to sleep, dreams came like storms. In all of them, there was one thing in common: his gaze, always the same. Fixed, intense, vivid eyes, staring at me from the depths of the cave or from my bedroom window. Sometimes Thomas would stand motionless in the middle of the room, simply watching me. Other times, he would whisper my name close to my ear, but without moving his lips. And when I woke, the room still felt filled with his presence. I stopped talking to my colleagues. I distanced myself from my family. People started saying I needed rest, maybe professional help. But how do you explain to someone that you've been seen by someone you shouldn't see anymore? How do you convince someone that the gaze of a dead person still haunts you? No psychologist would accept that without raising an eyebrow. So I kept quiet. I quietly resigned and left town. I moved to a smaller county, bought an old house near the woods and lived alone. No phone, no television, no internet. I thought silence would save me, but it didn't, because silence is exactly where it lives now. Even after all this time, I still wake up in the middle of the night feeling like I'm being watched. I don't hear footsteps, I don't see shadows, but I feel it. And it's not like before, when everything was doubt and discomfort. Now it's certain. He's still around, and somehow he chose me. I don't know why, I don't know what he wants, but I know it's not over. And I know this because recently another body arrived, another burial, another presence that didn't seem at peace. And what I found in that coffin was even more disturbing. A few days ago, I received a call from the new administrator of the neighboring town's cemetery. He said he needed help with a special exhumation process involving old documentation, complex bureaucracy, and the lack of accurate death records for a man buried in 1998. I initially declined, claiming to be retired, but something in his tone changed my mind. It wasn't bureaucratic urgency. It was fear. A contained, calculated fear. The kind of fear I recognized just by hearing it. I went there reluctantly, just to avoid carrying the burden of a mission. When we reached the grave, the ground was strange. The tools wouldn't sink in properly. The earth seemed denser, as if it had absorbed everything around it. Sound, wind, smell. And when we finally opened the coffin, the silence between us was so profound that I heard my own heartbeat. Inside, the body was over-preserved. It made no sense. More than 20 years had passed. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the corpse's condition. It was what was on the coffin's inner lid. A scratch, an incomplete sentence, shaky letters written with a fingernail, as if the deceased had awakened and tried to communicate with whoever came next. And there, between silence and horror, we read together what was written. If you are reading this, he is already out. I looked at the administrator. He was sweating coldly. And in that instant, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. It was a cycle, a sequence of interconnected events that no one had the courage to record until now. If you've made it this far, it's because you felt what I felt. It doesn't matter where you are right now, how many lights are on, or whether you're trying to convince yourself this is all just a good story. Trust me, some stories aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to warn. So if you want to know what that body whispered before being buried for the second time, and why we've never been able to keep that grave closed again, subscribe to this channel. Now, because I still have stories to tell, and you haven't seen the worst yet.